Okay, we're live.
Okay, very good. Welcome everyone to the Planning Commission meeting of March 17th, 2022. We'll start with roll call.
Chair Pevsner.
Here.
Vice Chair Dennison.
Here.
Commissioners Dallas. Hutt.
Here.
And Spears.
Present.
Terrific.
We
All right.
have a quorum.
Next, approval of the agenda. I'm going to suggest, well, that we reverse the order of the agenda and go from item 3 to 2 to 1.
I move that we approve the agenda as amended. Second.
Okay, have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
And if I can just make a quick
Go ahead.
announcement, basically saying we're changing the order of the agenda to be able to accommodate people who are here to speak on the last discussion item.
Correct. Very good. Thank you. Very good. Okay, so now we need the approval of the minutes of March 3rd. Anybody go ahead.
I have a couple of corrections.
Okay.
First, I'd like to delete line 88. There's a number of items that I brought up, and that one wasn't one of them. That was in an earlier draft.
Okay.
And then, instead of having bullets, I'd like to number them. And then on line 105, where it says that we discussed them. I think if we're going to list them, it's worthwhile to say which ones we decided to move forward with. So I'd like to note that we included number 2, but not numbers 1 and 3. Because we decided we wanted to hold off on 1 and 3 for the future and just deal with the 2 now.
Okay. Tom?
Anything else?
No, that's it for me.
Okay.
I move we approve as amended.
I'll second.
Seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Passes unanimously. Excellent. All right. Council liaison report. We don't have a council liaison today.
Oh, you do, but.
Oh. Nothing? Okay. Very good. Thank you. All right. So this will be the section of community input. This is a section when anybody can come up before the Planning Commission to speak on something that's not on the agenda. You have, I can't remember if it's 5 minutes, but I'll give you 5 minutes if you want to. Make sure it's on the agenda. Some of the items, might cross over, so try to avoid redundancy if you've come on something on the agenda. All right, and I'll allow some latitude as far as that goes, if you feel it's more appropriate for the agenda. Okay? Anyone to come up to speak on something not on the agenda?
Hi, my name's Carol Farrell. I live at 215 Wilson Street, and I've lived there for 35 years. I am directly across the street from the entrance to Alverno parking lot. The last 5 to 10 years, the filming has become such a problem with the amount of traffic, trucks, people, that it has completely interrupted our quiet, peaceful enjoyment of our homes. And it has totally changed the feel of the neighborhood since 1986. There was filming then, some classics, but it was a couple times a year, not a problem. It has become, well, nobody is our advocate, not the city, not the school, not the police. Nobody advocates for the people that live across the street and the surrounding areas. And I frankly worry about if and when I need to sell my house, that it's going to affect the property value. All they have to do is do a little inquiry about the neighborhood, and they're going to talk about it. I would just implore the city to consider the use of the TUPs in providing more and more and more and more filming. There have been times where literally in one day, probably 50 or 60 times, shuttles have come to drop people off because during COVID, they could only have one person in the truck or the van at a time. They would come over and over all day, just a big circle. And I feel like I'm living in a lot for a film studio. And my question is, what about us? What about our homes? What about our lives? Don't we count?
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to bring up something not on the agenda tonight? Very good. It's, that particular, actually, that particular item about the filming is really not part of the TUP, but if you want to, if you came in late, I saw you walking late, why don't you come up and say what you want to say in a few.
Your part was really confusing, as was the agenda.
It's okay. That's okay. Go ahead.
Good evening, Planning Commission. My name is Kristin Stevens. I live in and work at 717 West Grandview Ave. Thank you for initiating this long overdue conversation, which allows me to speak for my family and for our Gerhardy Heights neighbors who are unable to make it. They have a lot of different conflicts. This was also very short notice. Thank you for finally acknowledging that this topic of what amounts to Alverno Heights Academy's long-running commercial rental businesses and how it negatively affects our home and the well-being of our family. We want to preserve our rights and appreciate the opportunity to be stakeholders in this process in order to find some peace and quiet again. The language, I already spoke about that. 1, we do not feel we should have to beg for compliance for what is already in the city code. 2, no resident should have to be a forensic document specialist in order to have their peace and quiet. 3, we ask that you read through my family's experiences and our neighbors who have given input. My apologies for not being able to edit. We cut our vacation short because we did not realize that it was conflicting when we got the card until we looked at the date, decided to be here. Please determine how it will be enforceable and the remedies for violations, because under the current code, we get nothing addressed. Even after pointing out the city code or the provisions of a TUP, the violators just keep engaging and doing what they've been doing. There needs to be changes to our city code for filming after this revision. Years of Alverno's failing to abide by the various stipulations and agreements, whether it be their CUP, their Villa TUP, their K-8 traffic plan TUP, their K-8 TUP, and the mediated terms of the lawsuit that they agreed to abide by, have been a negative force upon our home and lives. An impact that has just tripled with the K-8. The filming, which Principal Fernara has publicly bemoaned is needed to pay for the tuition of her students, has gotten out of hand. Why should the neighbors shoulder the burden of financing the school through any TUP, whether it's filming, party? But we'd also like to have addressed their pro bono usage or usage in kind. It's the gray area usage. It's still usage, it's still parties, and we noticed that the weddings are coming back. We just ask that you look at other cities and their language and what they have put in force. There's a lot of cities out there who are going through the same thing I guess our city is doing. We just have a woefully inadequate city code for TUPs. There's just not much language. And then enforce it. There needs to be sanctions, there needs to be remedies for the neighbors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. That's about it. I'm gonna leave it. I'm sorry again about the length of my article that I was unable to edit. Thank you.
Anyone else want to speak on something not on tonight's agenda? Okay, then we will move to that item on the agenda, the item number 3, temporary use permit, or discussion on temporary use permits, making modifications to the code. Is there a presentation?
We have a presentation this evening by Jen Peterson. You see Jen sitting at the corner of the dais for many, many years. Jen has been processing the temporary use permits now for 14 years. So Jen is going to be making the presentation, and she's probably the most knowledgeable in the planning department regarding TUPs.
Great. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks. Good evening, Commissioners. For your consideration and discussion this evening are proposed amendments to Municipal Code Chapter 1788, which governs temporary use permits. Temporary use permits are used for events on private property, which are expected to have a greater impact on surrounding neighborhood. The impetus for this discussion was comments made by concerned residents during Planning Commission's review of Alverno's master plan, where Commissioner Hutt requested further review of temporary use permit and film permit procedures. Film monitor Lauren Hines is scheduled to review the film permit procedures with the Planning Commission on April 21st. Filming permits fall under the purview of the Community Services Commission, which makes recommendations to the City Council. Filming is not part of the zoning code and therefore is not within the purview of the Planning Commission. Residents in the neighborhood surrounding the Alverno Villa and those living in the vicinity of the Lavender Marketplace have expressed concern over the number and impact of events being held at these locations. Each of these properties has been granted temporary use permits. Alverno has been granted an annual temporary use permit, which is unique as they hold the only annual temporary use permit within the city. This policy was offered to Alverno to allow them to continue to rent the villa for private events while drafting their master plan. It was intended to be used as a stopgap measure until the master plan was approved, but the first annual TUP was issued in 2010. Rental events at the villa provide subsidy income for Alverno Heights Academy, and the annual TUP does not cover filming events. The Alverno master plan will give the commission an additional opportunity to review policies regarding events and filming at the villa. Lavender Marketplace is a unique property on Olive Avenue where the homeowner has created a home-based business which began with craft workshops to be held in her garden or conservatory. That business has grown now to include rental of the entire property for events such as weddings and parties, which occasionally include the rental of her adjacent property, also owned by the proprietor of Lavender Marketplace as an Airbnb. The owner of Lavender Marketplace has maintained current business licenses for both the workshop/wedding venue and the Airbnb rental. This venue has seen an increase in larger events, resulting in 7 temporary use permit applications so far this calendar year. Under our current code, the larger events such as weddings and birthday parties trigger the TUP requirement, but the workshops, which are held on weekends, do not, due to the size and number of the attendees. As event frequency grew, there was also a growing number of code enforcement complaints, mostly were due to parking and noise issues. Temporary use permit approval may include conditions of approval at the discretion of the Director of Planning and Community Preservation. Each application is reviewed by Planning, Police, Fire, and Public Works departments, and each department can enact conditions of approval as they see fit. Events that include the sale of alcohol carry an additional set of conditions of approval, including proof of the ABC license, requirement of uniform security, and the use of distinguishing cups to serve the alcoholic drinks. Recently, for larger events on private property, the condition of the use of municipal lots for off-site parking and a valet service has been added. This evening, the Planning Commission may consider the proposed amendments to 1788, which include addressing the frequency of the events, the duration of the events, and the exemptions, which will codify existing policies. Staff is seeking direction on the proposed amendment and any further amendments that the Planning Commission would prefer. This concludes my report, and I'm available for any questions that may arise during your discussion.
Jen, my question is if there is a TUP issued for an event and a member of the community complains, does that come back to you?
It can. Typically, the complaints would occur after the event, after which the TUP has already been issued. And typically the TUP is only issued for a one-time event, such as a block party, not repetitive events.
Right. So you may hear about it. Now, your office is not open on the weekends when most of these things happen. Who follows up on enforcement? Because we've heard a number of instances of problems. Who follows up on enforcement as to the structure of the CUP and what's written in the CUP?
The police department would receive the initial complaint, and I'm certain that they would follow up. Because they are made aware of the conditions of approval in each application, they would be made aware of any violations then.
So it would be up to the police department to, when they show up, do they issue a citation?
They can.
Do you receive information about that citation? In other words, would it come back to you that last time XYZ group, had this party, there was a citation issued?
I would assume that it would, but I have not received one.
You've not received one.
So I can't say for certain that when the citation has been issued.
because what I'm trying to find out is that, I mean, we can recommend a lot of actions and things tonight, but if there is no, A, if there's no citation, and B, if there's no follow-up, then we're kind of spinning our wheels.
Understood. That is a known challenge, is the enforcement of the conditions
Yeah,
because
and,
of our staffing concerns.
and, you know, who takes responsibility for the enforcement is not the same person that issued the CUP and explained the limitations. And so I'm kind of at a loss because, I mean, for the other things that the Planning Commission does, we're aware that a lot of things happen on the weekends in Sierra Madre. And, or also on long weekends when, you know, remember, half the Fridays in the month, the City Hall is closed and there's no one here. And, you know, I'm not naive, that things are scheduled for those weekends. And it's because they're assuming that the enforcement will not be present. Or there will be a disconnect between the person that issued the document and the person who comes out and tries to find out what's going on. So I'm trying to, you know, figure out what feedback loop that can be created so that if there is a problem, you know, the next time the CUP is requested, there is something on file that said, well, hold it, the last time we had this, this, and this.
That has begun to happen because we have begun to loop in the police and fire departments during the approval process, as opposed to just notifying them that something has been approved. Now they're helping to review the applications. I think that, and I'll defer to the city attorney here, that the provisions of the TUP code itself do not speak to any enforcement and doesn't have any provisions for citations or revocation.
Yeah. It's like cutting down the wisteria vine. So, what can we do?
Yeah, so as Ms. Peterson pointed out, there are no provisions in the TUP provision that regarding enforcement. However, every violation of our municipal code is subject to an administrative penalty and or criminal penalties if the police department chooses to pursue criminal penalties. So I think the question you raised, Commissioner, is the right one, is the feedback loop. How do we get information back to City Hall from what's happening, you know, on the ground on weekends, so that we can be made aware of it and we can follow up with the applicant either after the fact or when they apply for their next TUP. It's definitely something we can include in the ordinance, some kind of report, some kind of follow-up, some kind of enforcement mechanism. It's something to ponder.
Well, as a former fireman, for some events, you know, we were hired to be present to look for fire code violations, and we know that the police officers are often hired to do police work and to make sure the laws are being followed at some of these events. I noticed that the code asks for private security to be present. I'm not sure that someone who's hired by the applicant is going to look after the city's interests or be familiar with what what's in the TUP. So I mean, I don't have a clean solution for this, but it seems to be that there's a lot of people who have witnessed or been experienced, you know, some unhappiness, and there's no way, there doesn't seem to be a way of having that affect future events.
As a point of clarification, I think that the events where the police and fire department are involved are on public property, typically parades or the candlelight walk or something like that. Those are overseen by the Community Services Commission. The TUP is only for items on private property. So it may not be appropriate for the police or the fire department to be hired to be part of that. The security guard requirement is something that we have done at the request of the police department as part of the alcohol conditions or the conditions for events which serve alcohol. It does need to be a certified and uniformed security guard. It can't just be,
Some guy.
right,
Any-
their
any-
largest friend.
Any more questions for Jen?
Yeah, I had one question on, a number of times in the code it talks about non-commercial use. And I sort of wanted to explore, what does commercial mean in this setting? Because, you know, if somebody's renting out their property for a wedding and getting a fee for it, I see that's, you know, commercial. And then on the other extreme, you know, somebody's just having a Super Bowl party and inviting their friends, that's non-commercial. But what about like school fundraisers, church potlucks, things where there's nonprofits involved, or, you know, if there's one nonprofit holds one for another, you know, that kind of thing. Do we consider that commercial use, or is that non-commercial?
No, that's a perfect example of what a TUP is for. If someone were to want to have a large charity event at their house, selling alcohol, having a bingo night, having a, you know, that's what they're kind of designed for, so that the event can proceed in a safe manner and in such a way that it's conditionally approved, it's monitored, and that it also can't be shut down inadvertently by the neighbors if, you know, their complaints.
Right, but there's a couple places in the code where it says for commercial uses, and it has requirements, and then non-commercial. So is a fundraiser for a community group, is that commercial or non-commercial?
Commissioner Hutt, can you point out where in the TUP code it says commercial or non-commercial? I'm not seeing a distinction.
Not right now.
I don't see it specifically in the TUP code. So if it's outside the TUP code, then it might be outside the scope of this discussion.
I'll look for it.
And-
I think we identified commercial, non-commercial in our proposed edits.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
I-
what I'm talking about.
In the proposed edits, I don't see.
Here's, under D, exemptions, non-commercial gatherings.
So D, exemptions, house parties, private non-commercial gatherings of up to 75 people. Is that what you're referring to?
Yep.
Got it. I think what we were trying to get at with that is exactly as Ms. Peterson stated. If something is being rented or sold, then we're considering that to be commercial. Now, to your point, if it's a fundraiser at a home, if it's for a commercial purpose, I imagine we deem that to be commercial. If it's for a non-commercial purpose, I imagine we deem that non-commercial.
Well, for instance, when my kids were at the nursery school, we had an annual fundraiser, and often it was at somebody's house. So it's a nonprofit having a fundraiser where they're not, you know, paying the people, because the people their kids go to the thing, and so they donate it. So is that non-commercial or commercial?
I would think that's non-commercial. They're raising funds for a nonprofit.
So it's
or
the
for a school.
nonprofit that makes it a non-commercial?
I think it's the ends for which the monies are being used. Yeah.
Okay.
How many TUP applications do we receive in a year?
Well, the last few years have been a little off, but I would say probably about between 8 and 12 per year prior to COVID.
8 and 12.
Yes.
And if you were to guess a percentage of approval rate?
Oh, 100% approval. We have not denied, we've denied one in my tenure here. But we work with the applicants to figure out what they need and what their event is trying to look like, and see if we can get it to what they need. Of what we have done in the past, like I said, they've been block parties, they've been fundraisers. For example, Archie Rogers just had their anniversary celebration. That was the first one for this year. But prior to that, prior to this year, we haven't had this large of a volume of this type of event. This is unprecedented thus far.
So let me say this back and make sure I understand it. So in past years, it was 8 to 12 in a year, and we've already received 8 or 12 45,
Correct.
75 days into the year.
You are correct.
So this is going to become a much larger problem much sooner.
Well, people saved up during COVID and.
That's
they
right.
wanted
Now
to-
they're gonna make up for it.
Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, you said 7 of those were the Lavender Marketplace,
That's correct.
which seems commercial. So it's only one outside of the Lavender Marketplace.
We've had 2, yeah. One is for the British Home June Fair, and one was for Archie Rogers.
And those aren't listed anywhere, like online.
They are not.
That was one comment one of the people who emailed said.
Okay.
Any other questions? If not, what I'll probably do is, go ahead.
So if
that-
a business in town asks for a TUP, is that a commercial use?
It is.
So do you make the distinction between commercial and non-commercial TUPs?
We do not have that distinction. We do not have separate distinctions or separate criteria for evaluating those.
It's just in the proposed code that.
Yeah,
That, it currently doesn't exist, that
yeah,
distinction.
you don't because it doesn't exist, but there are,
So for example, the TUP for RT Rogers, it was to, what, use more space on the street?
Yes.
Good. If no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for public comment, and I'm going to allow Ken Farsing, who, to come up first. Basic need, he had some issues, so welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Honorable Chair Pevsner and Commissioners, Director Gonzalez and staff. I'm Ken Farsing. I'm the chair of Alverno Heights Academy Board of Trustees, and Alverno appreciates the opportunity to address the Commission on the proposed ordinance amendments. We've provided a letter that more fully explains the background of the villa's temporary use permit and the issues of concern. The private rental events in the villa are regulated under TUP 0917, which was approved by the City Council in 2010. And as Ms. Peterson indicated, it's kind of unusual. The villa is designated as a city historic landmark, first constructed as the estate for the Barlow family. The villa is a replica of a Tuscan villa designed by Michelangelo. The noted local architect Wallace Neff planned the villa and its historic grounds. The family sold the estate to the Sisters of St. Francis in 1949, and the city approved a Catholic all-girls high school in 1959. The villa was designated a city historic landmark over 20 years ago. The school added a Catholic co-ed lower school in April of 2020, and a master plan amendment for the construction of the permanent classrooms is currently under commission review. Now, the proposed amendment would limit TUPs in the institutional zone to 12 events per year. The villa's TUP is approved with a limit of 30 events per year. The reduction in total events will result in a significant loss of revenues, adversely impacting the maintenance and preservation of the villa and its historic grounds. Now, a goal of your general plan is to preserve historic structures to the maximum extent possible. Your historic preservation ordinances call for the city to collaborate with owners of historic landmarks to relieve economic disincentives to preservation, including consideration of adaptive reuses. By approving the villa's TUP, the City Council implemented these preservation goals. Now, the villa is used for school events such as retreats, religious services, receptions, and fundraisers, and for non-school events such as weddings, wedding receptions, birthday parties. A joint use agreement exists between the city and Alverno to permit the use of the villa for city-sponsored and community group events. The villa has been used for city award ceremonies, the fire department events, and community organizations like the Friends of the Sierra Madre Library. Now, the villa's TUP conditions were negotiated with the neighbors in 2009 and 2010. The conditions cover the frequency of use, time of events, noise, parking, circulation, deliveries, event setup and takedown, event scheduling, catering, and more. Now, the report states that residents have expressed concerns that multiple TUPs are being used to convert certain institutions and residences to commercial uses. Alverno is a nonprofit corporation, is not a commercial use. There's no profit from the operation of the villa or the school. The majority of the proceeds from the private rental events are used for the maintenance and restoration of the villa, which is a substantial financial burden to the school. Now, the villa is located on a large 12-acre institutional parcel of land. It has 114 fully developed on-site parking stalls, and it's served by Michelinda Avenue, which is designated by the city as a major street. The City Council recognized these facts in granting the villa's TUP in 2010. The council found that, quote, "The villa is located entirely within the Alverno campus, and therefore private rental events will occur entirely on private property and will not impede the reasonable use of nearby properties." The council concluded that the villa's private events are a, quote, "reasonable use of land consistent with the general plan and zoning classification." Now, the city anticipated that Alverno would apply for a conditional use permit for the villa's private rental events. The council stated, quote, "The issuance of a TUP does not override the existing requirements for a conditional use permit and master plan for permanent development." The villa is eligible for a conditional use permit based on both zoning and historic preservation ordinances. Listed conditional uses in the institutional zone are churches and other places of worship and places of assembly, which reflect the historic use of the villa over the past 3 decades. The need for a conditional use permit for the villa was discussed at the Planning Commission's November 21st public hearing on the master plan amendment. Now, Alverno recognizes that the commission is considering the citywide need for an ordinance amendment. However, the proposed event limit will harm the historic villa, the school, and the community. Respectfully, Alverno will be applying for consideration of a conditional use permit for the villa to maintain and preserve this valuable historic landmark. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. Question, go ahead.
A point of clarification. As the gentleman just stated, these are intended to be default rules citywide. But Alverno is going to be applying for a CUP. That CUP will have special requirements. Those special requirements can include the number of events they have on site. That's through their CUP. So they would have special rules that are different than default rules. It'll be up to the Planning Commission to recommend whether or not they want to not have special rules for Alverno and have them follow the default rules in the city, or have a special carve out through the CUP for Alverno.
So,
That makes sense.
but can I just ask one follow-up? So if there's a CUP and a master plan for Alverno that's approved, it could, as part of the institutional use, it could specify you can rent out for weddings X number of times, and then they wouldn't have to apply for a TUP, again, because
Correct.
they would be under that, and we could regulate.
Correct.
Okay, that's, thanks.
So their special carve-out now comes through the master plan?
No, they have a year-long TUP that they apply for every year, if I'm not mistaken.
And so and they're the only ones with a year-long CUP?
Yes, that's correct.
TUP.
TUP,
TUP.
that's correct.
And that happened because,
That was, the first one was issued in 2010, and it was issued to allow the events to continue at the villa, the rental events, while Alverno was
master plan.
drafting their master plan.
okay, all right. And so it's just been renewed every year based on that
Correct.
assumption, okay.
It is reapplied for, paid for, and renewed every year.
So everyone else has to do a TUP every time they want to do an event?
Correct.
Okay.
But our code does allow for an annual TUP.
Mhm.
They're just the only ones that apply for an annual TUP.
Okay.
And the city council has ruled on it every year since 2010.
Granting the TUP? I don't think so.
No, the city council, it's at the director's
Oh, it's
discretion.
ministerial approval?
Right,
So the city council approved it 12 years ago,
right,
and then it's been renewed at staff level for 12 years.
correct.
Because there hasn't been, in those 12 years, a new plan.
No new CUP and master plan have been brought forward, correct. Which will change this year.
So if it's renewed every year, it's not just renewed, it's adjusted as it's each year?
We will look at the conditions for each TUP that we review, as Mrs. Peterson indicated. So That's how we approach this. If we're starting to see that there are issues, we want to try to address them in the conditions of approval.
And does the Alverno annual plan run the calendar year? Or does it start on, July 1st, or when was the last one approved, I guess?
Calendar year.
Calendar year, okay.
And they have to come and notify for one of the events if there's an event count?
Well, for Alverno, they do notify the residents of the events that they are holding for that calendar year.
But they notify staff as well?
Yes.
Is that part of the requirement?
I believe it was originally to outreach with the community. And I would assume that, yes, that was part of the requirement of the original TUP that went to City Council.
So the requirements that are in there that were approved initially by the city council and then get renewed every year, how is your office able to make sure that they are complying with that?
As was already indicated, many of these events occur on the weekend, so we don't have a code enforcement officer present on the weekend. There has been discussion that we flex that individual's time to be able to have a presence at least on one day on the weekend. That would be the only opportunity to do that. Otherwise, we're relying on the police department.
Okay.
Ken, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, we had, provided a letter to the commission that outlines some of the 40-some conditions that are in our TUP. One of them is that we basically keep on our school calendar all of the events that are in the villa, and that we basically provide notice letters, to the neighbors every quarter. And so that's been part of our, outreach, to the neighborhood in terms of the events that are happening. And what's interesting is that originally when these were negotiated conditions with the neighbors, it was a facilitation effort where we hired MIG as a school to meet with the neighbors in 2009 and 2010 and came up with these conditions, and then basically they were passed on at that point to the Planning Commission and City Council. And we believe those are good conditions. We're certainly willing to take a look at those. They could be adjusted. It's been 12 years. But we do, as part of that, meet with the neighbors. The TUP required quarterly meetings, and in the first couple years we were having meetings every 3 months with the neighbors. And then the neighbors actually suggested we go to meetings twice a year. And so we do those at the beginning of the school year, at the end of the school year, and we basically at that point, and we're, at any time during the year, if somebody has an issue, we certainly do our best to try to respond to it. But what we do is basically at these meetings, they've morphed over the years to talk less about the private events, which, to us are, at least from what we can tell, the private events aren't a big issue, but they turn more to, the neighbors want to talk more about the school. So that's we've allowed that. We're happy to get input from the neighbors, try to make adjustments. But the letter does, and I think if you looked at the resolution the council adopted, you'd see I think it's a very comprehensive TUP set of regulations. So I just wanted to provide that clarification for you. And Julia's here, Finara from the school tonight, and also Andrea Bertolini. Andrea's our facility manager, and she does a lot of interaction with Ms. Peterson on the various events. We do occasionally have noise complaints. We do have a security guard for the weddings and that, those type of things. They are briefed. The caterers are briefed. They're given copies of the TUP, to abide by the TUP regulations. So we basically work with, the caterers and our security company to make sure that let's say it's a noise at the villa, it's a wedding, and, they basically, the DJ's too loud. We basically then get a call from the neighbors, or the police come to see us. We then have somebody on property that basically takes care of the complaint. So at that point in time, I'm not aware of any citations that we've received from the police department in the last 12 years. So I don't think, we're not trying to be bad neighbors. We're trying to basically work within, the regulations that the city has given us, and try to manage the facility. But anyway, I think it's a very interesting TUP once you look at it.
Okay, yeah, if we need to bring you back up, because I'm going to let everybody else
That's
speak.
fine.
Okay, yeah, no problem, and even let Ms. Finara speak. Okay, yeah, please.
Hi, Keith Stevens, 717 West Grandview. We're on the north side of Alverno. And it's been quite an education from my previous speaker. What we've learned is that Alverno is exempt from most every rule because they have another category to fall into. And as the residents, this is exactly what we're trying to say, is that the show never ends over there. Every evening, every weekend, and come the seventh day, there is no rest, there is gardeners at 7 in the morning. Just the overall institution is just has flaws, and the way the CUP and the TUP and the nonprofit and everything else has stacked up. It's all stacked up against us. We do not have a voice. I spoke to you at a meeting in December and talked about the noise and no response. The very next day, there was a wedding at Alverno, and we recorded music at 120 dB at the sidewalk. We contacted the school, got voicemail. We contacted the police, got nobody out there. The music continued for several minutes at 120 dB before it went down, and we tolerated the rest of the night. The quarterly meetings, we got notice of a meeting, and the notice arrived 3 days before the scheduled meeting, and it said you have to be vaccinated, boosted, and have a negative COVID test to attend this meeting. So Alverno claims this was a typo and they didn't have time to correct it and mail out 300 letters in time, and so there was perhaps a dozen people at the meeting, because anybody who may have cared looked at that and said that's a lot of requirement to go to an outdoor meeting. And this is just what it's like dealing with this institution for 30 years. It's always, golly gosh, that was horrible, we'll look into that and take a note. But it's all the same, it's just, and forget about the school, just talking about the TUP, and I don't see how the filming can be separated from all this. So since we're talking about TUP, what is temporary, and I believe it's an unusual short-term exemption to the rules, but I know this annual TUP and just back-to-back, month-to-month, event after event, there's nothing temporary about it. I think the problem is that Alverno just has a failed business plan, and they are reaching out, doing anything and everything they can to try to sustain themselves, but doing it under the guise of a school where they're financing so many of their students. It just, again, I think everyone just needs to take a step back and look at the whole thing and the whole use and the whole impact, because it's not working for us, and we've been doing lots and lots of rounds with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? No, you were speaking at the other event. This is your own, you got your own time.
I would like to ask that you look very closely at what started in 2010 on the TUP, and language has been changed to benefit Alverno to allow more noise. The neighbors were not involved in the last many TUPs, so that's kind of a BS statement to say that. We wanted to be involved. We'd like to be at neighborhood meetings. They haven't occurred. My husband and I have sent letter after letter saying, please meet with us. They had meetings during the pandemic with every builder, prospective parents, and et cetera, but they would not meet with the parents. I mean, with the neighbors. The language was changed, and I've written to different people saying, how is this possible? Why is this happening? We never agreed to this. One of our concerns was that there's confusion in whether it's a live band or not a live band, or where they're standing on the property. There was a wedding so loud with amplification down by the Highland Gate. It was a drummer. I got corrected by Miss Bertolini that it was a ceremonial drummer. It doesn't matter. When that guy is beating his drum, we hear this all the time in our house, and we're sick of it. We shouldn't have to keep calling the police, and it's really just disconcerting that we do call the police, or we hear that our neighbors have called the police, and we're told, yeah, well, they're having a good time. That's not what our police should be doing. We have asked them to come out. We have asked them to address situations. I have a screenshot of a police dispatcher, and I've been trying to talk to Chief Armelin, which we've talked a little bit about it, who said, we were a bunch of effing Karens, and F them, and I'm not sending out our dispatchers. This wasn't the first time I'd heard of this, but I was glad I actually was able to find it, because I've had a friend who was at Starbucks, and there was somebody on the police force discussing the neighbors around Alverno and how they had complained again, and just blew them off. It's like, oh my gosh. So we know we're not being addressed in this situation, and Mr. Farsing and Ms. Fanara can get up and say all they want. We know what the reality is that we're living with, and we're not getting addressed. There was no meeting during COVID for the neighbors. The neighbors didn't ask to have 6 biannual meetings. Alverno did, and we didn't even realize it was in the TUP. I'm now pulling all this stuff to look through it. I'm pulling permits and going, how come this kind of information is not disseminated to the neighbors? But you can't have a look at these TUPs and go, this is just such a great TUP, and the neighbors had input, because we only had input, or some people, but we didn't, in 2010. And since then, I don't know who, but we need to find out who's been changing the language that benefits them. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Good evening. I'd like to tell you about one example. My name is Cynthia Swank. I live at 239 Wilson Street. I'd like to tell you about one example that is representative of the typical private event that occurs at the villa. The private events regularly violate chapters 9.32 and 17.88 of the Sierra Madre Municipal Code. On the evening of November 20, 2021, just 2 days after the November 18 CUP Alverno Master Plan Update meeting, a private event occurred at the villa that had music playing and a DJ speaking, both loud enough to penetrate my double-pane windows from 500 feet away. This event violated the municipal code as well as Alverno's specific TUP. I did send an email to planning on November 23rd detailing the following violations: alcohol being served during the last hour of the event. As heard from the sidewalk, the DJ announced last call at 9:13 and the event ends at 10. All around the property, sidewalk decibel readings exceeded 60 decibels. And my husband and I walked the perimeter clockwise and counterclockwise. There was no security walking the property perimeter to check the decibel readings, as is supposed to happen per the TUP that I was given by the city. I think the police department would surely shut down any house party at a local residence with the kind of sound levels that I've described. So why does Alverno not have to live up to the city code and their own TUP requirements? So that was just one event.
Thank you. Anyone else?
My name is Colleen Thomas. Our family lives at 249 Wilson. I addressed a lot of our concerns at the last CUP Planning Commission meeting, but I'll recap some of my anxiety and concerns about Alverno and all of their activities, fundraisers, filming, and now the K-12 grades on their campus. We moved in 6 years ago. It was quite peaceful street. We never heard the 100 or so high school girls. Imagine for a minute, if you all could, if we walked up to Alegria. It would be silent, it would be serene, it would be beautiful, you could hear the owls. Now, imagine Wilson Street, that's what it used to be. Now, you come over there, and it's like Halloween night on Wilson and the surrounding neighbors. So that's what it feels like. So does any of you go to Alegria anymore on Halloween night? Probably not a lot of you. But when you do go up there, it's crazy, and that's what it feels like. Even after the last CUP meeting, Alverno said we were trying and care about our neighbors' concerns, but they don't. They finally did set up a neighborhood meeting, and I was horrified that some of these neighbors for all the surrounding streets have been dealing with this for years. Breaks my heart to see all these neighbors who haven't been heard, who've been constantly lied to. I noticed a new traffic study must have been done on Wilson Street within the past month, which I know they had to do. I find it very interesting that the traffic study was done on a week that they were only school for 4 days. And for some miraculous reason, there was never a line of parents dropping off and picking up. Once again, who schedules these traffic studies? Alverno? They, of course, did it on a shortened school week, no games after school, no events, and no filming. You will never get back a true and accurate reading of what the traffic is like on a weekly basis on Wilson. I feel that they wiggle around a lot of city guidelines with the TUP, calling it a school event, fundraiser, or an activity. I would like to also see it possible to have no parking on the west side of Wilson and permit parking on the east side of the street. Maybe add some speed bumps. Also help with the parents and kids not watching their speed on Wilson as well. I'm truly tired of coming out of my house and not even be able to get out of my driveway because it's blocked by cars. Alverno said in the last meeting that their parking lot would fit all participants with the school activities on site. Again, not true. With dances, cars overflow onto the street and along with the loud music. I spoke to one of their staff members who said that they have done a decibel reading at some of their dances and events. They then reported to Alverno staff that the music should be turned down, that the decibel readings were well above the TUP says. They were ignored, and Alverno staff just continue to allow the music to blare as loud as they like. They don't care about us. So concern for the neighbors is an understatement. I would also like to mention that on record, I know I'm not supposed to mention this, but I was mortified that I have not signed a single yes to a filming permit since March of 2020. And my name is Colleen Thomas, and that's not the name on here. So Filming Commission, you guys all, City Council, need to come together and figure this out. This is not the Sierra Madre that I moved into, and it's really sad. And what I will leave you with is, think about this for a minute. When you drive by Sierra Madre Middle School, you drive by St. Rita's, you drive by Gooden, you drive by Sierra Madre Middle. The first 20 minutes of the morning is really busy. The last 20 minutes of the day, 5 days a week. We are talking 18 hours a day, almost every day, from Highland, Grandview, school, everything. It just gets tiresome. So the police won't do anything. I've called, they've said, oh, there's nothing we can do, our hands are tied. So I would love to see you guys put the filming in with this TUP, put in more restrictions, get fines up, because fining's only gonna do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Just Fernando, you want to speak, or it's up to you? Just looks like everybody else has spoken.
I appreciate everything we've heard from the neighbors tonight. We've heard it before. I don't, I can stand up here and tell you a different story, but we are trying our best, and that it's a school, and there are school events, and there is going to be traffic, there is going to be noise, and we do our best to consider our neighbors. And I do mean that from the bottom of my heart, even if not everybody in this room believes me. So thank you so much for the time.
Great, thank you. All right. Well, I'll bring it back to the commission at this point. Ugh. Difficult.
So I just wanted to clarify something, or actually, I think two things. The TUP decision that we make tonight would not have an effect on Alverno currently because they already have their annual TUP for the rest of the year. Is that correct?
The TUP that they have right now goes through, I believe, August. That's their cycle. I believe, and I would defer to city attorney on this, that the CUP or master plan would then override anything that they have in place right now. So that would that would then make that null and void, and then the CUP and master plan would take over.
Right, but just so that we're all on the same page, that's not what we're talking about tonight. Tonight, we're talking about changes to the TUP, and when, as he erroneously stated, it's not with us, we're waiting for them to come back and present again, right?
That's correct. The Planning Commission asked Alverno to conduct a number of studies, noise and traffic. They're going to be, and I had that conversation with them as recently as last week about the status. And they wanted to make sure that school and everything was back in operation in person to be as normal as possible to conduct those studies.
Okay, so they will be coming back and
They will be
presenting, and
coming back,
that's
yes.
that's the time that we would actually be able to affect these kind of events there at the school.
Yes.
And Vice Chair Dennison, I just want to add that it's not necessarily the case that Alverno has to have special rules. We could apply the default rules that apply to the city. So by adopting, of course, we're not taking any action today, but in the future, if we do come back to the Planning Commission with the recommendation for an ordinance that sets some kind of default rule that applies to non-residential zones, that would apply to Alverno, assuming their TUP expires, we don't renew it, and there's no CUP in place. That covers this.
Okay. So
I'm assuming that the planning commission doesn't have the authority to spend city money, so we can't add things like enforcement to our recommendations.
You could,
You can add to it, but with that, you don't have to fund it.
Long.
Right. Okay.
Well, so I guess if we're going to start talking about, but I just wanted to make that point of clarification that the Alverno matter, we're waiting for them to come back, and that's when we'll be working on this. So anything that we don't do tonight isn't because we don't want to do anything or work on this. It's just that it's not before us tonight for Alverno. Okay. So I guess to your point, one of the things that they do on film shoots or events, the Wisteria Festival, I think, has to pay the police department to bring people in. So, and I know that there was question as to whether or not it's appropriate for police to be at events. Is there a liability associated with them being on private property rather than personal?
I believe it's a city event issue. So the 4th of July parade, Wisteria, these are city-sponsored events, as I understand it, and that's why there are police officers present. If it's not a city-sponsored event, we generally don't have police officers present.
So when there's filming, they don't hire...
The filming is a totally different issue, but for film permits, I believe we do have a system in place where officers are allowed the opportunity to take this extra job, and they're going to get paid by the studio for it.
Right. I guess I understand that we're not doing anything because that's a CUP and not a TUP, if I understand it correct.
No, that's a film permit.
Okay, a film permit. It's not our purview, but I'm trying to find a like situation that may help us with the enforcement side. If somebody knows that, and to the point earlier of it there being a commercial and a non-commercial use, that if it's a commercial use, it seems like if somebody's going to be making money on this, that they should go ahead and assume the costs of enforcement as part of the application. So that way we don't have to spend city funds.
Right.
And if you're going to make money on the event, this will be part of your balance sheet and decide whether or not.
And if we can do it for film permits, why can't we do it for TUP?
And it's not guaranteed that an officer will take that job for the film permit, in which case I believe they have to get another security guard. When Lauren Hines comes before the Planning Commission on the 21st, she can probably talk in greater detail about exactly how that security issue is handled. But it's completely optional for the officers to take that shift. They don't have to take on that job. So I think
We understood, but I mean, I think they often enjoy it because it can sometimes trigger overtime, which isn't paid for by the city. It's paid for by whoever's sponsoring the event, which was what I was after, is a self-funded way to have monitoring there that has some teeth. People are less likely to disobey the rules when one of our finest uniformed officers is there.
From our fire department history, that as an example, for film permits, there's a fireman on scene as a safety officer. And they pay, it's part of the permit. And does it have to be a police officer for some of this stuff? Maybe, maybe not, but my sense is that the paid security officer that's being paid by the applicant seems to have a conflict of interest in, what they need to do. And I would prefer to see someone from the city who may be working just a few hours to show up to make their presence known, but to at least see, because all these letters seem to come about because something happened, and it becomes a he said, she said, and one group says, well, news to us, and the other people are saying, no, there's, blood on the sidewalk. So, at some point in time, I think the city's gonna have to figure out how to deal with that. And it may be only people that we trust to tell us what's really going on.
So more common than an officer taking that shift or a firefighter, because usually that only happens if there's some kind of explosion happening as part of a production. More common is that there'll be a film monitor. So that a film monitor is someone that I believe works on the weekends, and they bring him in and he just does this job. So having like an event monitor would be the equivalent, I guess. Someone that's not law enforcement, not in the fire department, but is paid for this position on weekends.
Okay. And we can stipulate things that they take readings of sound and make a log, and then that becomes part of the record?
Do that. As part of the permit fee, could that be, include the fee for the event monitor, be included in the fee and then paid, they're paid by the city rather than the applicant?
The fee would be paid by, the cost of the film monitor is always paid by the production company. The difference I'll note here is that with films, it's a production company, whereas with these individual events, it could be a homeowner, it could be a local business, it could be Alverno. So deeper pockets is the real distinction between these two different types of permits. But it would be paid. The city pays the film monitor, but paid through the fees that it collects from the
That's what I was
applicant.
asking. That way they're working for the city, not the applicant.
That's how it is.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, but if we're talking a commercial activity, so I guess I'm working under the guise that we can come to some sort of agreement about commercial versus non-commercial, and then this becomes a much easier conversation, right? If this is a non-commercial use, it's really easy to say you can have 2 events a year, or some really low number that's just not gonna bother anybody. But if you were gonna do a commercial event and you're gonna make money on it, I think that you should be subject to your own enforcement. That's kind of where I was headed with this.
Yeah. And I would even stipulate that in the feedback loop, that a monitor is only required after X number of complaints. So we'll allow people to have the benefit of the doubt initially. So if there's some place where there is we used to have a Masonic lodge that would have events and things like that, and if they could pull it off and have a good relationship with the neighbors and everything like that, that'd be fine. But after 2 or 3 or whatever complaints to the office that issues the TUP, then it says, well, you've had so many complaints, so we're now going to have to start with the monitoring program and go with that. So they have to earn the right to have it monitored. I mean, that way not everyone is guilty at the start, but they can earn their the stipulation.
May I point out that not every event venue applies for TUPs, such as the Masonic Temple. We've not issued multiple repetitive TUPs for any events held at that facility.
Okay, but I just gave that an example of a place where there are events.
I guess what I'm trying to explain is that a lot of our TUPs are not repetitive.
Yeah, I think
They're
that,
singular use,
right.
One time only, and that's none in,
single event,
but
yeah.
aren't, other than Alverno, there was at least one other location on Olive that was mentioned.
That is new this year. That is historically not the way it's been happening.
And if there has been complaints associated with it, I think I've read a few in the many letters you sent us today. I mean, to me, that would mean that would trigger something like, okay, because if many of the venues have no problem and they can come up with an event and it goes off and, you know, no one is upset, then that's fine. But if they're having more than one event and we're seeing complaints, then I think that should trigger some kind of response on the city side to make sure that it's being conducted in such a way that, you know, they can do it within the guidelines.
And for that particular venue, we did respond, and our response was then, because most of the complaints were parking related, then we conditioned that they needed to use off-site parking and use a valet service
Okay, and we
for
go.
any event.
Okay, and we go back to the, you know, have they fulfilled that obligation?
And that would be up to the police department.
Yeah.
That's
Or if we stipulate maybe an event monitor.
correct.
So I think that brings up the other part of what I was thinking about, is that we have zones for a reason, and doing a commercial TUP in a residential zone is kind of skirting the way we do things. We haven't zoned it to have that kind of an activity.
I think it's okay every now and again, because it's temporary, right? And so I think we have a problem where a temporary use permit becomes just the normal course. It shouldn't be. We shouldn't affect zoning through a TUP, right? And I think the annual TUP for Alverno was meant to be a special use case because the master plan was supposed to come. I think it doesn't make sense to have Alverno on a TUP. That's part of what they do, right? It's not like a once-a-year block party or something like that. And so I think for Alverno, we need to look at the master plan. We need to comprehensively look. Because to me, when we talked about it last time with the school, we said, don't worry about the private events. That's handled through a TUP. Don't worry about the film, because that's a film thing. We need to look at all that at once and look at how that functions at that site and for the neighbors without sort of doing the shell game. But for the TUP code, I think we really need to think of these exactly what we were saying, as temporary uses that happen infrequently. And if somebody has a historic site and they're adaptively reusing it and it's going to be a business in that, then fine. Let's do the appropriate rules for that. But the TUP should be few and far between. And so in the proposed code revisions, you know, staff has proposed limits, and I think that makes sense. And to me, that's the easiest way to sort of trim that down. But I guess we could deal with more Alverno things later, but it seems to me that if we have a site that frequently has these things through a master plan and a CUP, you know, why can't we put in permanent noise testings, you know, outdoor, that just feed right to the city, and we have it like recorded, and so there's not this he said, she said stuff. You know, if it sounds like 120 to me, but it's not, that's sort of my issue, right? But if it's 120 and the people who are in charge are ignoring it, and then we have a log of it, it's going to be really simple to figure that out. And I think that's, you know, we have to think of the feedback loop a lot more, and putting the TUPs on the website, which is one of the people that sent us comments said, I think that's a really good idea. So you can understand when these are. The other thing is, you know, if your neighbor's having a big party and they didn't do the right thing and invite you, yeah, maybe you want to go out of town that day, you know, so you don't have to deal with it.
Or at least tell you.
Yeah, I mean, but if your neighbor's having like that once a year, you know, but if they're having it many times a month, yeah, that's a different issue.
I think it's the multiple times that where it becomes kind of a sore point. I mean, everybody has a wedding reception for their daughter, and, you know, but usually they have the skill set to go around the neighbors and say, hey, this is what we're going to do, and this is when we're going to do it, and sometimes they include a bottle of wine with it, and, you know, and that's the way Sierra Madre should be. But, you know, if it comes the third or fourth time an event, and there's been some unhappiness that's especially been logged with the city, then I think it falls into a different, because A, it's no longer really temporary, but B, they've got a bad track record, and we really don't want this thing to fester and create, because we have seen that, you know, when you ignore these things, they don't go away. And I'm sure we have city employees that would like to take the test to become event monitors and make some overtime.
Yeah, and they could wear like a city shirt, so everyone knows who they are.
So then,
Josh says no.
I like the idea of actual mechanical or scientific methods permanently installed at places that have repetitive events. So there's no arguing, you know. It's a number. It came in at this time. It's, you know, it's a neutral sort of piece of fact.
Who pays?
I would think the private party would pay to have it installed to continue their numerous profitable events.
Okay.
Given tech, I can't imagine it's all that costly now, right?
probably has to be calibrated from time to time.
Yeah, somebody can't put their bubble gum over this microphone.
Okay, fair enough. No
and
bubble gum, we'll write that in.
And that's for the comprehensive conversation that we have, right? So we'll have to all go do some homework before that. But I guess for this, I think that I did like the dividing up to commercial and non-commercial, and I think that we should limit the commercial use. I think 6 times per 12 months is rich. I was really thinking once a quarter. I can lose a night of sleep once a quarter. So I was thinking 4 times a year.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I would have gone 2, but for commercial, I mean, these are big events, probably.
I'm open to I mean, for commercial, I guess the other thing that I would recommend adding with the commercial is the staffing of an event monitor, so that helps discourage it from 4 to 2.
So are we distinguishing between commercial in a commercial zone and commercial in a residential zone?
I wasn't.
No.
I think if you have an event, you have a monitor.
Yeah, and we might also want to put some, a threshold on the number of people and whether there's a monitor. This exemptions like a small party of 25 or less, that makes sense to me, but a non-commercial gathering up to 75 people, that still sounds like a lot of, I mean, if your neighbor had a party with 75 people for a benefit of some group, so it's non-commercial, that still sounds like a big impact to me.
Yeah, to do that once or twice a year.
And so, I don't know what the right number is, but if you go over a certain amount, you need a monitor, or if you have a track record of having that. I do think we need to bake in some sort of feedback loop so that if there's a lot of complaints for one TUP, you can't go back and undo it, but you need to be a way to look at that the next time they come in. One other comment that one of the people said was that we need to keep in mind the impact on all neighbors, including for uses that are on the edge of town. So if it goes into Pasadena or Arcadia, those people are people too, even though they're not Sierra Madrens. And so if we have any kind of requirement to notice or get a permission or anything, it should include those people, I think, if they're in the radius.
Commissioner Dennison, earlier you had stated that you're not drawing the distinction based on the designation of the parcel. You're drawing the distinction based on the use or, what the funds are going to be used for. I would say from an enforcement perspective, that becomes difficult because then we have to confirm whether they're lying to us or not. So that can be challenging. Whereas if it's based on the parcel, that's very easy for the planning department to determine. Commissioner Hutt, to your point about 75 people, the idea there was some people have big families, and then when they have a Christmas party, they might have over 50 people there. We're not expecting people to get TUPs for Christmas parties. I agree with you. Finding out what the appropriate number is the challenge there.
So, I mean, I assume that this is a government form that they're swearing some form of affidavit to if they're applying, or am I giving this form too much weight?
There is a form, and it was included in your
Right.
in your packet.
But I guess
Swearing an affidavit,
might be a
you
little
know,
steep.
You can make it a criminal offense?
There is language at the bottom that says, I hereby certify that I have read and will abide by all rules and regulations of the city of Sierra Madre as a duly authorized representative of the sponsoring organization. And on behalf of the sponsoring organization, I agree to defend and hold harmless the city of Sierra Madre, together with its officers and employees, against any and all liability or claim thereof, for any injury, death, property damage allegedly suffered by any person, including sponsoring organization, its agents or employees, due to, caused by, or arising out of the acts or omissions of the sponsoring organization, its agents or employees, or the negligent acts or omission of the city of Sierra Madre, its officers, employees, and occurring during and as a result of the exercise of the privileges and the permission hereby granted to sponsoring organization, its agents and employees. Nothing about being.
That's good work there, Mr. City Attorney.
But I will.
I was thinking the same
You're thinking the same thing, right?
I will bet you, if you look up the historic records for the number of times the district attorney has prosecuted someone for lying on their TUP certificate, it's pretty slim.
Right. I guess, at a certain point, I don't know that we're going to have the enforcement against that. But are you recommending, let me understand you bringing it up, are you recommending that we make a distinction as to the zone matching or not contraindicating what the event is?
Yeah, I think the efficacy of the enforcement is going to really depend on how easy it is to enforce. So, for example, if Commissioner Spears, you're talking about requiring a monitor, maybe not after the first one, but after multiple ones, that becomes difficult to enforce, because then we got to figure out, okay, how many complaints have we received? How many times have I had the event? It's easier, just as an example, it's just easier to have a monitor there
Every time.
for every time there's an event within a specific parcel that's designated not residential, for example. So it's just something to keep in mind, because obviously enforcement is a big part of the problem. It's not to say that maybe the code doesn't need amendment, but it seems like enforcement of the existing rules and conditions of approval is the biggest problem.
It seems like we have that problem already.
Yeah. The other issue is enforcement of events that people don't even bother to get a TUP for, and those probably often are even worse, because they're not even pretending to follow any rules.
Well, I guess technically, if we start distinguishing, then a Tupperware party would be a commercial event, and if they didn't have a TUP?
Yeah, I sort of feel like maybe it's just better to go like with a number of attendees, or if there's alcohol, sort of these kind of things that are pretty objective and easy to monitor.
And then just maybe, so if I'm hearing you right, instead of doing the differentiation, just saying you get 4 events a year.
You get 4 events a year.
And you're going to have
If you have over 100, you need a monitor. If you have alcohol, you need a monitor. I suppose that most people's Christmas parties, there's probably people having alcohol, but they don't have a paid caterer come in usually, and if they do, they have a license too, right?
We'll probably have a lot of events with 99 people.
Yeah, fair enough. There always is.
I don't want to let imperfect be the blocker of some code that deters most people. If they're going to get around the code, or if they're going to lie to us, they're going to continue to get around the code and continue to lie to us.
Well, the idea of an event monitor, I think, is appropriate, because it seems like we can't rely on anyone else to give us the information and also to act in behalf of the other residents in town that may be, impacted by whatever the event is. And so how we deal with that, I don't know. How the city's gonna build that program, I don't know. But I think some event, some way that the city can have some assurance that at least that there is an attempt being made to follow what they told you when they took out the permit.
I would also like to point out that the temporary use permit ordinance also covers, pumpkin patches and Christmas tree lots and carnivals. And are you prepared to require an event monitor for all of those as well?
And that's why we have that provision in there that allows for 45-day TUPs for exactly things like that, these seasonal commercial uses.
We may then want to break it apart so that the events the pumpkin patches and the Christmas Christmas tree sales are in a commercial area.
Yes.
So things that take place, inside of a commercial area during normal business hours are one thing, but it seems like when these events happen is the sore point, because when it's happening at 9 o'clock at night, that's even though it says, well, at 9 o'clock you're gonna stop the DJ, or at 9:30 you stop the DJ, and at 10 o'clock everyone's out and things like that. We can't rely on anybody to it seems like we're having a hard time relying on people to follow that.
The seasonal retail sales is otherwise vacant portions of privately owned property.
In the commercial zone?
But it would have to
not
be in the
specify
commercial
as-
zone in order to.
Does not specify zone.
Not now.
Well,
I'm having a pumpkin
I'm
patch
having a
this
pumpkin
year.
patch, that's right, yeah.
Otherwise vacant property.
Oh, vacant.
Yeah, my front lawn is vacant.
Like the lot next to the hardware
So
store.
like the lot in front of Arnold's is the one.
Right.
It's private.
There are not many more vacant lots in Sierra Madre.
But I think your point about the time is really an important one, because even if somebody had a party during normal business hours in the commercial part of town, I don't know if that's a big a deal. If you're doing it in a residential zone at 10 p.m. at night, that's a much different thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my initial thought was to break it down to try to mirror the zoning.
Yeah.
So that, because if you live in apartments across from a great big parking lot that maybe has noise at night,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of where you moved, versus if you're on Olive, for example, where it's pretty quiet at night.
And I do remember that there used to be a brewery in town in the Ice House, and one of the reasons it shut down is that there were people who lived on Montecito who complained.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a problem with people living in that was somewhat commercial zone at the time.
Industrial.
Industrial zone, yeah.
Well, the biggest person to complain is the guy who owned the property, but
Yeah.
That's
So-
also true.
I'm trying to think. The biggest problem we have is neighbor complaints that's driving all this to a large degree, it seems like. So, is there anything in here that says that the neighbors within a certain radius have to be notified?
No.
And then also, I don't see anything in here that requires the police to forward complaints back to the permit issuer.
You are correct.
So those two things would go a long way to help the neighbors, who are the biggest concern here, I think.
I like that. I mean, if the city also published the list of TUPs that it has issued, along with a summary paragraph that says, in Sierra Madre, the following things need to be, and if there is an issue, you can contact whatever, so that there is some kind of feedback loop. And to your point that we can still receive information from the public about complaints, through that portal, and it can be logged.
Regarding the publication, that's something we can do now potentially. So after this meeting, Ms. Peterson and I will go talk to the city clerk, and we'll see if there's the possibility of creating a separate page for for TUP permits and just posting those. Shouldn't be a big issue. So
How-
we can look into that.
How early do people apply for these?
They're supposed to be in no later than 20 days prior to the event.
Because I think, you know, to your point about the noticing the neighbors, the mailing the cards is pretty expensive, and it looks like junk mail. So I don't know how effective that is, but I do know it's going to be a big cost. But if people are applying 20 days ahead of time, and we have a website on the city, website that says, here are the TUP applications, and not just the ones that are granted, but the ones that people have applied for, that as a neighbor you could look on and say, oh, there's this thing down the street from me, these people have a history of blah, blah, blah. That might be a much more effective and cheap way of notification to the neighbors.
But along with it, will alcohol be served? Will there be, parking, additional? In other words, the requirements that you explained to them when they took out the TUP, they have to have if they have to have an alcohol permit, so if they've been told that people can't park in the neighborhood, there's going to be something else, so that everyone is aware of what the rules are, because the person that takes out the TUP doesn't have to tell the neighbors, oh, we're serving alcohol.
Some parameters might be helpful in enacting those, especially the parking one. Alcohol is alcohol. It is or isn't. The one way that people get away with that is that they say, well, I'm not selling it, but if people happen to be drinking it at my house, I can't help that.
Right, okay. But did they take out an ABC license?
Most likely not.
Well, but
if they're serving it as part of the event, catered event, then typically a caterer will have an ABC license.
And that's just a fact, and that fact maybe have everybody aware, along with a summary of the rules about, okay, when you have this TUP says that, what will and will not happen. So everybody's on the same sheet of music.
Are you looking then to have the application published or the approval letter? Because those are two different.
Which would be more clear to the public, which would be more clear to the lady that lives down the street that wants to know, what's going on up there?
Yeah, I would think you'd put the application on when it comes in, and then when it's approved, you'd put the approval letter.
We can discuss this we'll have to discuss it with the city manager as well as the city clerk, but this is something internally that staff can probably do.
We're gonna meet with the film people, but it seems like having a film shoot thing.
We are already getting ahead of myself, but for the film permits, we're actually contemplating doing just that with the signatures and everything posted online.
Yeah.
What if the application permit had the adjacent neighbors sign? I know it's a hot point right now, but they had the person who's has the parcel, owns the property that's having the event, actually personally gets the signatures. That kind of contact goes a long way.
You must get along with all your neighbors, and they like you because you're a good person.
No, but
I'm not sure all of us enjoy that same.
That whether you like the person or not, be personally told this is going to happen is.
They've been told.
Highly beneficial. So.
But as long as you, I don't know whether I could. Well.
You don't think you could ask your neighbors for
No, I could ask my neighbors. I don't know whether they'd all approve. But you never know. If you're getting somebody on a bad day.
I'll note another issue to consider with the signature requirement is what we're seeing is often people want payment in exchange for their signature.
Yeah.
So that's something you might encounter if you have a signature requirement as a part of a TUP.
Yeah, but that's with the film shoot, right?
That's what the film shoot said if we do it in the TUP.
One of the issues of the film shoot is, as you mentioned before, there's this notion that Hollywood has deep pockets, so let's sock it to them. And I don't think maybe people have that same thought about a TUP where you're trying to, raise money for your community group. And not to say it's right to necessarily treat the Hollywood people that way either, but I think that that's a perception that's more prevalent.
I mean, I would still like to see as part of that notification is some way of providing feedback to the office, and if you believe that, you know, these events were not, if these rules were not followed in any way, or whatever, if there's a issue that, you know, please, whatever, however you want it reported, so that, you know, next Christmas, when they come in and say, you know, we want to have the annual Spears Christmas party, they say, well, hold it, last year there was, you know, a problem.
I think we can include Ms. Peterson's picture and her email.
My cell phone number? Sure.
So it sounds like where we're headed here, because we're just giving direction for the code to come back to us. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I think that the things that we kind of agreed to were 4 people only. Is that right? I mean, 4 events. Sorry. 4 people only. That'd be a great way for the city to make money.
Vice Chair, is that because it's currently written that there'll be no more than 6 per 12-month period in a residential zone and 12 per 12-month period in a non-residential zone. Are you saying 4 in the residential, or are you saying 4 total?
4 annual.
Regardless.
I think 4 total.
Yeah.
I assume that there's an appeals process with this, like everything else.
It'll go to the city council for. Oh, you mean for the TUP permit when it's issued? There's an appeal process, yeah.
Yeah. So if they
appeal to, do they appeal to us, or do they appeal to? If they appeal,
right,
it goes to whom?
It goes to the Planning Commission, I believe.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Perfect.
But that's 4 a year, not 1 per quarter, right?
Planning Commission.
Yeah, just for a year. I was
Yeah.
rationalizing.
Fair enough. I get it.
And I guess we won't be able to do the monitor if we're not going to really specify between commercial and non-commercial. Because I don't think it's fair to impose.
Well, at some point in time, we may want to have some kind of, the feedback loop might need to be more, or at least the enforcement loop may not, we may need something, because, you know, the city is not good on enforcement. I mean,
Actually, somebody said, let's do it based on the number of attendees.
yeah.
So if you've elected to have a very large event and you go over a certain threshold, then you're just accepting that
Yeah.
I'm going to have to get a monitor for that.
Yeah.
So what number was that you picked?
99.
99.
So that we wouldn't get just a.
Well, and I just think more effectively is what Peggy suggested, is that since some of the neighbors expressed, I know we're gonna handle Alverno separately, but that it's like going to a hearing where someone lies and the other person, if someone says something and someone says complete opposite, and the judge is going, you know, how do they adjudicate this, right? So since there's no reporting back to Jen, who's gonna be the person who's gonna then put these penalties on her, maybe we could put a requirement on the police, no matter that they don't just blow them off. I know it's relying on the police department to say, okay, we'll report everything. Okay, I'll tell the city. You know, that way all they have to do is say the city, not we're going to go over, you know, guns blaring and, you know, decide to crack down on this, you know.
And that's
noisy
okay unless
event.
the police have calls.
Regardless, I'm just saying the dispatcher could just say, okay, we'll tell the city, you know, or, I mean, unless there's something that's serious about it. Because then we can tally the events more accurately, because they come back to Jen, because right now she gets no feedback whatsoever. And then the next time these people come up, we have some kind of process to be able to say, okay, listen, we had a bunch of complaints, whether they're valid or not, you got to do this next time.
But I don't think we need to codify that, right? Because she can just, when she walks over and says, hey, will you sign off on this? Then I assume that they notify dispatch and that shift when this happens, that this event is going on. And so they should be informed that they need to.
Keyword should.
Well, but part of that notification process to police and fire could easily be, here's the email address and the phone number for people to call when they have a problem with this.
Or they could even have a card that says that when they go out to the event and say, here, if you have an issue, this is how you document it. And even if they delivered that to the person who's making the complaint, that would be a big step forward. Because right now, what we're hearing, what I'm reading in this is that people call someone who should have been available, and they're getting voicemail or nothing. And so at least they have a way of registering their issue with the city.
Mhm. I guess one question I have, I just really don't know, is we heard before that there were very few or none police complaints about Alverno. What has to happen to be a complaint that goes on record? Like, if somebody just calls the dispatcher and says, hey, there's a bunch of noise, is that an official complaint, or do you have to fill out a form? It sounds informative when you hear, like, there's X number of complaints, but if you don't know what that means, there might have been a lot of people who called the dispatcher and said something, and if it just sort of fizzles out, it's underrepresenting.
So absent a citation or a police report, there is no documented record. It's just the phone call.
So if a dispatcher is called, somebody complains, says, oh, this thing's too noisy, I mean, even if the police go out and say, hey, you guys are being too noisy, just chill out, that's not ever going to show up anywhere.
That probably wouldn't generate a police report, no, not an incident report.
And that's why I was recommending the notification
Yeah,
process
yeah.
at the time that it's delivered, so that there's some way to close that feedback loop. Because candidly, I don't know that the best use of police time is taking police statements for noise complaints rather than patrolling on the exact number of calculated officers that we run at, right?
Although the most calls on Sierra Madre are dog barks. So, something is happening, but I agree. But what we're looking for is the feedback loop, so
Right.
that the next time that the TUP comes up, that's like, whoa, that address rings a bell, kind of thing.
Well, sadly, I'm sensing a certain lack of respect that the police are giving these complainers, which just breaks my heart, because I don't like to think of our society working this way. And to codify a feedback loop from the dispatcher or from the officer that goes out would give the complaint some respect.
Commissioner Dallas, unfortunately, that's not something you can do through the zoning code, though. You couldn't codify requirements and impose them on the police department through the zoning code. For that to happen, it's something that it's administrative, and it would have to happen basically through the city manager working with the police chief.
Yeah, I get the feeling that the whole police department and city hall all are sick and tired of the complainers. Which I can kind of get, but I don't want to live on Wilson, I've heard enough. So.
And you would think in a city small enough like Sierra Madre, we would have the time to devote to these issues.
Yes.
Yes, I agree.
Right, but I mean, there's also this thing where if a police officer goes to the site, encounters the issue, tells people to quiet down, and they do, sort of done the job, right? And so, and at least immediately. And the problem is that's not logged anywhere. So you can see later on, oh, we got 12 of these over and over again.
Yeah, but then you get the folks, nice folks from Alverno here sitting there going, but we don't have any citations. We don't have any complaints. And so they get the feeling that these people are just nuisance complainers because nothing's happened.
Right, I agree.
And it's not working in a
And there's no way to capture,
fundamental sense.
there's no way to capture the complaint at the time.
Yeah.
I agree.
So it feels really, I can understand why the neighbors feel powerless in a city that should be working for them. I don't know. That's not our venue here, I guess. So I don't know.
Right, but I mean, we can't change the zoning code to address that, but we can make a recommendation, and then staff and city council can make whatever appropriate changes they think follow from that recommendation.
So do you have what you need?
I think so. We could, we'll discuss it further and with the city manager as well.
All right.
I'm glad you're addressing this. Seems to be an issue in town that is disrupting the, zen.
All right. So, good. Well, then let's move on to the second item, moving backwards, municipal code text amendments, ordinance cleanup. We have some kind of...
We do have a PowerPoint presentation, and our associate planner, Wolf, will be delivering that.
To clarify, we're doing ordinance cleanup, right?
Okay. Yes.
That's correct.
Correct.
Number 2 is number 2.
Good evening, Commissioners. Tonight, I would like to bring for discussion ordinance cleanup, which is Municipal Code Text Amendment 2205. So just as an overview, a prioritized list of Municipal Code text amendments was approved by City Council on February 8th. This followed the Planning Commission's discussion on that same list. And to recap, the MCTA categories were a response to state mandates, of which we've done affordable housing updates, urban lot splits, ministerial design review permits, Starter Home Revitalization Act, and also in tonight's agenda would be accessory dwelling units. The next category on that list was to conduct an annual ordinance cleanup, and then follow that with prioritizing Planning Commission suggestions. And a recap on what the ordinance cleanup is first, amendments to our single-family residential zone to make and provide for a reduction of the prevailing front yard setback to 25 feet with the approval of an administrative design review permit. Currently, to do so, an applicant would request a variance. Next would be to reestablish the covered parking requirement in R1 and R2. Previously, RC zones were on there, but they were never required covered parking. Next would be amendments to our R3 zone to reduce the side and rear yard setbacks for garages to 3 feet. That's in would be consistent with our R1 code. And additionally, not part of the list prior to this, but recommended by staff, would be to include development and construction site standards for the R3 zone, which are in the R1, R2, and RC zones, just for some reason not in the R3 zone. Next on that list would be amendments to the manufacturer zone. This would be kind of for East Montecito. This is just to fix cross-referencing with the C zone that occurred and kind of fell out of sync during the commercial code update. Next would be amendments to the development standards section of our code to remove the minor conditional use permit requirement for arbors and decorative features.
5 years post. It's here.
The intent with the decorative features was to allow for these items to be over 42 inches and up to 10 feet in the front yard, and still limit these features from being visual obstructions. For example, visual obstructions for drivers at corners of streets. Next was amendments to 1752. This is our hillside management zone. It should, prior to this, there was confusion with the RH terminology between that being residential hillside or residential high density, which were two very different things. And originally we had to look at the whole code and say it shouldn't be RH, it should be just H for hillside. But since our housing element was adopted, we're getting rid of RH from residential high density and just making that R320, R330, and so on. So the only amendment we really need to make is the change to the title from H to RH. The next is amendments again to the hillside management zone. This is to include modifications from the standard architectural standards, similar to what we do with development standards, but this is in regards to modifications of the angle plane requirement, which is currently required a variance to do. We wanted to make this an administrative design review permit instead. And last on here is to require the a licensed architect for applications for administrative design review permit and hillside development permit. And again, as a recap for the suggestions from the Planning Commission, actually no, before that, there was cleanup items here to address a discretionary demolition permit process. Commission recommended that we move these to a longer study session, and especially with the R2 code, so we'll be addressing these at a later date. And suggestions from the Commission formerly included the reduction of the maximum allowed floor area in all residential zones by 800 square feet. City Council did not want that, so that's been struck. Next was to consider pre-approved ADU plans for obviously ADUs, and develop guidelines and standards both for commercial and residential, and a design review for multifamily, including C zones. For for objective design standards and findings. Again, these will be addressed at a later date. Tonight, the Planning Commission can discuss and consider the resolution, which would recommend adoption of the ordinance for cleanup, and we are recommending Commission discuss and consider this, as well as make live edits as needed, if needed. That concludes the presentation. I'm open for comments, and I'm also able to edit the live document on screen if you'd like.
Great, thanks, Josh. Any questions for Josh?
I have one sort of technical question. The red lines that you provided us are from current code, right?
Right.
And that is not necessarily the same code that's online, because there may have been amendments to current code that haven't been published yet.
That could be
Some
true,
cases,
yes.
yes.
Okay. Because I didn't have, I mean, I guess we'll have public hearing, so I won't go in. I just, a couple of the references didn't line up to the ones that were online.
So our parking code online does not match the parking code we have adopted. That's one example. But that's not one of the exhibits here, but yes, I would agree with your statement.
Any other questions? Okay, great. I'll open it up for public comment, then we can come back. So stand by, Josh. Anyone want to speak on this item? Seeing no one, we'll move it back to the Planning Commission. Oh, no, Kelly? You want us to talk, Kelly? Oh, I'll get my face up here. Does anybody want to speak on this item? If not, then I'll move it back to the Planning Commission. Includes our City Council liaison if she wants to come up and chime in. You want to expand on what you were talking about, John? Maybe start
Yeah, I mean, substantively, I'm good with all of these. We've talked about these many times before. So I don't have any issue with them. And to the extent these are sort of arcane, and if they're baffling to anybody, including city council members who want further discussion on this, happy to talk, because we've been through some of these through different versions for
Go
many
back
years.
years.
Yeah. The one site issue was the arbor thing. In the code online in 1748-130, it's sections F and G, and in the packet it said it was E and F. So I just want to make sure that whatever it is, it lines up right. I don't think I need to see it again. But I just want to make sure that we're amending the right numbers. And there was also a couple of places where we have like a letter and then numbers underneath, and we delete some things. And if we delete them so there's only one thing left, we don't need to leave a 1. We can just delete that and move it up. Just sort of, more administrative cleanup. But
Yeah.
all the substantive, I'm totally good with.
I think those formatting things are worked out probably just by the word processing document.
Yep.
Okay. Anybody else? Comments? Go ahead.
What was the rationale about needing the covered parking for an addition?
Requiring it, you mean?
Yeah.
The covered parking is because it used to be that in the code, we had parking numbers and parking, the covered part in the parking code and not in the underlying zone. And then we started to figure out, like, we wanted different types of covering or no covering. And so there was exceptions we started to do in the underlying code. So we said, okay, let's take all of that out of the parking code and just have that be the numbers, and then go back in and put when we want it to be covered. And so the parking code got passed that took out the covered, but we didn't get those other things. So right now in town, all parking requirements are uncovered. And traditionally, you know, in R1 and R2, those parking requirements are covered. In Canyon, it's unique in that we don't require covered parking.
What's the advantage of covered parking?
So it's been there. It's just something to get, I guess, to get the car off the street and have it be invisible. And
Yeah.
we all know that in California, no one parks their car inside the garage is storage.
Good point.
And you end up having a driveway, and that's where the cars are.
So it creates a requirement for more structure when we're trying to minimize the amount of structure, especially with the new ADU
Well, this-
enthusiasm.
Yeah, but this doesn't apply to ADUs, because ADUs have their own covered rules that
know,
say
but
they're
if-
not covered.
If you're doing an addition, then it's part of an ADU. I just don't understand the need for covered parking, just adding mass and bulk to a property when people aren't gonna really use it for parking.
And where it seemed to come about is when people added more and more bedrooms to a house, and with each new bedroom, we made the assumption that there would come probably a vehicle, and where would they be put? So it was more to get the vehicles off the street and into something.
I have no problem with requiring the off-street parking. I just don't know why it has to be covered. So, I don't know. I don't wanna stir the pot again, but that one did jump out at me. It's like,
Well,
what?
I think the goal was really just to restore what it was before, because we did a cleanup one place that changed it. You know, if we want to discuss whether we want covered parking or not, we could do that. And when the canyon zone was updated it was decided covered parking's not a good idea in the canyon, because for exactly the reasons you're saying.
Yeah, but as these properties become more intense, I don't think we want, in town, we need that extra bulk. So,
Well, I mean, people have long driveways too, and I know some people probably park 8 cars tandemly all the way down their driveway and get them off the street, you know, and then those of us that have a side by side, and that's all we got, right? Because I live technically in the canyon, so I know what that's like. I don't know. I think it's fine the way it is, because we already made that one accommodation. I think we can work around it, because we ran into one conundrum in the canyon where the person was going to tear down the garage, and we were going to require covered parking, and then we boxed ourselves into a hole where we had to say, oh no, it's okay not to have it. We had to, basically, that's why we carved it out of the canyon zone, so these poor people who were trying to cover the parking, which even if it was just a portico, just a awning, it was, in fact, I think it was perched on the person's property wall, which was the property line, right? And the neighbor was okay with it, and then they had to demo it, and then somehow we weren't going to let them put it back, even though it was to their advantage to have a covered area so they could get out of their car and walk into the little place in the canyon. It's right up the street up by me, so.
Actually, Peggy, you speak to the changes of how our in all of Los Angeles things are happening, because quite honestly, since the beginning, it's always, well, covered parking, and it was always just assumed covered parking, and no one asked that question. Well, why does that have to be covered? It's always been that way.
I think it needs to be required off-street to the degree possible, but it doesn't need to be covered.
Yeah, things have changed.
People are more likely to plant a tree to cover and get shade than build a carport. You know?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of bizarre, because if in other parts of the country, there are people that have homes or farms, and they have no garage, and it's 10 below, you know, and tons of snow. And why don't people build garages out here? In California, everybody has a garage, and you have 10, because you have 10 acres, and they just park them everywhere. They're not worried about where they're going to put them. I guess, yeah, I don't know.
I don't have an answer for you about.
If not, but for the changes to the state, you know, they've been forced upon us, we probably have to do things a lot differently. We're stuck.
What's, you know, is covered parking the regular for all cities?
It's very common, yes.
Yeah, it is common.
Not necessarily sensible.
Just like swimming pools in California. Okay, all right, culture. Someone want to make a motion? Or do you want to keep talking?
I'm not that much in love with covered parking that I need. I mean, I have a garage, never parked in it.
I guess there's part of me that I want houses to be updated as all of these houses that are getting older get updated, but I don't know that they need to get just added on to time and time and time again. And it's one of the things that makes people think about how they're going to add on to their house.
Is put in covered parking.
Is put in covered parking.
Yeah.
At a certain point, you're running out of covered parking, and it's another way that we can ensure that we get good design instead of lots of design.
You think that's really going to limit it?
And
I think that if you have to think about a covered parking for every time you decide to add another room onto another side of your house, that yes, at some point it will limit it.
Interesting, because I have a very deep property and with 3 little houses. And in order to get covered parking, we're all little places outside, I basically have to build a garage. When I build a garage, I'd build over it with more housing, you know, extend one of the small houses, just to, you know, make the added structure make sense. So.
Well, now you would just call it an ADU and get around that. So.
Yeah. I mean, with regard to the concept of the ADUs and applicability, I guess I don't know. I'm not really wedded to the covered parking, but for some reason in R1 it just seems to make sense. So if we wanted to drop it in R2, I mean, we're going to revisit R2 anyhow. I wouldn't have any heartburn with that. But I just...
When I first moved here...
I guess I'm not as big a crusader on this subject.
When I first moved here, you had to get your car off the street, and the reason that was told to me is because the street sweeper comes around at night. Well, now they don't come around at night. They come around during the day, because they wanted the curb open.
It's also easier to police.
And it's easier to police. But, you know, now I think there are so many exceptions granted for people who don't have enough driveway that there's, you know, a lot of people parking at the curb.
I actually, you bring up an interesting point, and I think that John's solution is a nice middle ground for that. If you're going to put multiple properties on there, maybe we're more lenient on the parking, but in R1, I think having covered feels right.
With that, yeah.
Okay, I can go with that.
Works for me.
So leave covered parking as is?
Leave covered parking in R1, take it out of R2.
Take it out of R2. Done.
Thank you.
Do we need a motion to approve that?
Oh, there's no, it's not a public hearing, so we're just asking for discussion at our next meeting. We'll schedule for public hearing.
Oh,
So you can direct us to schedule a public hearing.
All right, well, so move, we'll have, direct us to the next.
Do we need to vote on
Do
that,
we have
or?
to have we have to have a date certain, or just?
Not a date certain, just
anything?
to
All right,
direct staff to schedule the matter for public hearing.
okay.
I move that we direct staff to schedule the matter for public hearing and make the changes we discussed.
I'll second.
Seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. All right. All right. We'll move on to the third item, which was number 1 on the original agenda, consideration of municipal code text amendments in response to state law to adopt ordinance amending Title 17 zoning, Chapters 1722.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I may need to recuse myself on this because
All
I have
right.
an application from ADU.
Okay. Oh, good to go.
It's been nice.
And we do have a PowerPoint presentation by Associate Planner Wolf.
So tonight, I'd like to bring the discussion back for second unit ordinance amendment. We're calling this now ADUs, so I kind of want to stop calling it second units, just because I think that's going to cause confusion, especially when we delve into SB 9. So per our last discussion back in August, the commission recommended that staff draft several ordinance options. The first just being a baseline ordinance that is very much mirroring government code section 65852.2, which is the ADU law. Next was to have an ordinance which does that, plus include design and development standards. And then I had also included an option to have the baseline plus a historic and tree preservation guideline. So going into the base ordinance, this closely mirrors our state ADU law. It has built-in amnesty, which sunsets concurrently with state law, and it does require a rental restriction on certain ADUs. However, it lacks essential design standards, specific development standards, and standard regulation. And this baseline ordinance would be built upon by the optional ordinance addendums following this slide, which first is design, development, and procedure. It adds what the baseline ordinance lacks, which is design standards. It defines forms, materials, colors, and windows to match the primary dwelling. It does require that the ADU have a pitched roof. For development standards, it does require fire-resistant construction, floor area to be governed by zoning, except as otherwise allowed. The height standard has been simplified, and the front yard setback has been defined. Also included is procedure and regulation, which limits, has a limitation on non-permanent structures, but does allow for manufactured modular homes as ADUs under specific conditions. We do include a standard procedure for conversions and a requirement for recordation, policies for permit termination, and extends the policy for rental restrictions to all ADUs. And the third option, ordinance here, is for historic preservation. What this does is it's a process which closely follows the discretionary demolition permit process, but eliminates the discretion from that. It would require extensive historic analysis for properties with historically and/or exemplary architectural merits. This is where a property, for example, is found to be eligible for listing as a landmark. We would then ask that applicant to get a historic design review permit from our consultant. And I'm sorry, not a permit, but a historic design review report, which identifies and mitigates, identifies mitigations for any impacts on historical characters. And the tree preservation would just be a mirror of our current tree preservation ordinance, just for really clarity for the applicant to know how to mitigate impacts to protected species trees. Tonight, with the commission, I would like to discuss all of these concepts and choose one of the optional ordinances to be recommended. This is a discussion, so I would like to make live edits as needed, if needed, and select one of the ordinances to be brought back to Planning Commission forecasted for April 21st as a recommendation of an ordinance to City Council on April 26th. That concludes my presentation, and I will bring up any of these ordinances on screen where we can make live edits if you'd like, and I'm also open for questions.
Any questions? Josh?
Yeah, I guess the question procedurally is, if we're gonna, are we gonna like flip pages and go through and talk about each one, sort of discussion-wise?
If, yeah, if you have one you'd like to select and start with, yes, we can do that.
I'm guessing we don't have public comment, but
Yeah,
I want to get public comment and then we can
Sure.
just
Yeah, we can just
go,
have at
go
it.
through that way.
Sure. Okay, so I'll open this up for public comment. Anybody in the crowd want to speak on this issue? Seeing no one? Close the public comment and bring it back to business at hand. Okay. Let's see what page are we? Get up to the first one here. Oh boy. I can't stand this.
I'm a little unclear on which option is which. I was looking at Exhibit 2, which starts on 117 of the pack. And on the development standards, I guess I sort of wanted to discuss, and, you know, the concept of having development standards, I think, makes sense, but I'm not sure that these are really what we want. For an attached unit, having it sort of match existing structure makes sense to me, but if it's a detached unit, I don't know why it needs to like mirror the main house. I mean, especially if the main house is historic, you want to differentiate, you know. And some of the coolest designs are intended to be, you know, sort of different. So I don't know. I just, maybe we can get more expert advice on that, but.
Yeah.
You're right. You can get a really interesting dynamic between a modern and a historic house. That's hard to do. You have to get materials and colors to sort of still kind of talk to each other somehow. It's much easier if one matches the other. For instance, the ADU that was built in the front yard on Grandview, they're both painted that gold tint with white trim. And I don't know, it kind of works for me suddenly. I was appalled to see it go in, but it all kind of works as like a little unit now, put together. And that's because they match. And so it's a safer choice, maybe not the most creative. That's my only comment. I'm not giving advice here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems that with the whole objective standard concept is that if you go with the safe choice, you sort of make it hard for somebody to do something cool. And then if you try to do a subjective sort of exception, you can't. So I don't know how to, I guess maybe we say, okay, well, we're going to go with the safe choice, but it seems a little bit of a shame to me.
And if you recall the ADU that was proposed on Grove, which was the railroad car,
Right.
I was just going to ask about that.
it hasn't been submitted.
My question was actually more about the permanent foundation, that it would be mounted to a permanent foundation in section 4 above. Would that be, Roman 4, would a boxcar that's set on railroad tracks be considered a permanent?
The wheels of it are more design. I think it is bolted down and basically screwed down with with rebar into the tracks and further down into the ground.
Well,
Yeah, it was reviewed by the engineer, city engineer.
Yeah, I remember approving it. That came up. It's like, is this
Right.
going to roll into the house or
well, I mean,
the neighbor's yard?
everyone's thoughts of cool design perhaps differ, but a railroad car is not the same as whatever the main house was on that one. So,
Big box, as I recall.
Yeah, well, the garage up front.
yeah.
Okay, so,
And then the other thing was, on 1722-030A3, the pitched roof. It was, we say, where a roof of a primary dwelling is not pitched, the roof of the attached or detached shall be pitched. So we say in one it has to be the same, and then we're saying, but we have to have a different roof. I'm sort of not getting, I don't know that we're gaining a lot, I guess.
The concept there is to kind of simplify where the height requirement is and kind of get rid of that rule of thirds between the top plate and the coping of a roof. That it's just not well understood by your average everyday homeowner, and it becomes a convoluted process. So we're trying to simplify height by requiring a pitched roof at a certain degree. Now that can be changed. That number was just kind of thrown out as a standard.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we shouldn't trouble ourselves too much with the height because there's already a lot of bills that are like AB 916 that's going to say we have to permit 2-story ADUs. So, I mean, it seems like we're going to redo this ADU ordinance every stinking year because state law is going to change, but, so I don't know.
How much of this can we even enforce for ADUs?
Enforce all of it. Are you asking how much of this is actually differing from state law?
Yeah.
Josh, would you know that?
So in your report, it would be all of the blue text, which differs from state law and is not defined by state law, blue and the green text, and all of the stuff that you have in attachment B.1 is basically a mirror of state law.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly fond of these development standards. I don't think that they gain us much. I agree that sometimes having people take chances or purposely make something look different, the same way that we require them to in the historic preservation, might make a little sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's going to be attached, I can sort of understand that. And I get the no roof decks. I think sometimes roof decks are really cool, but you do run a serious risk of, you know, somebody putting the roof deck just right over their neighbor's yard. And again, this is one of those things where you've got to sort of make a dumb rule and you can't have exceptions. But on this one, I would err in favor of the sort of heavy rule because, you know, there's that concern. What's the setback, 4 feet?
Yes.
Yeah, 4 feet from the property line with a roof deck on top looking into your neighbors. That to me, I think that rule makes sense.
I agree on the roof deck. It was more of the matching of, and I understand for an attached one, kind of. I think that it's also an opportunity to make it look a little different.
Yeah.
The roof deck, I agree though.
What if roof deck's on a building in the center of the property?
Well, again, the problem is we have to make these objective rules. I guess maybe you could say no roof decks are permitted unless there's a really big setback. Can we say that, or is the 4-foot setback rule so clear in state law that we can't, you know, differentiate?
Yeah, we're limited to the 4-foot side and rear yard setback if it's 800 square feet or smaller.
Yeah, so
we wouldn't be able to.
Can't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that makes sense. That's a really, I think, an elegant way to deal with it. But yeah, too bad.
Well, we could, so if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, once you go above 800 square feet, that the setback is larger?
I believe so, and there's And also consider this, we can't have a setback requirement if it's going to be a conversion of a garage. So if the garage is right next to the perimeter of, of the boundary, then you might have the same issue.
So if you want an ADU on the property line with a roof deck, you just build it as a garage and then you convert it the next year. Yeah.
Our recorded meeting.
I mean, no, but I mean, it's sort of the inanity of some of these state laws that where they say, these rules that you can and can't do when there's so many loopholes to get around. So, I don't know, we gotta do the best we can. For me, I'm not a fan on these building standards of number 1 and number 3. But I like 4, and I can live or take number 2.
I think that's where I'm netting out as well.
Yeah, I'm okay. I think if you had a hip roof sloping away, if you had that minimum setback, it might face the building this way. But yeah, like what if you have it this way, right, facing the neighbor? It's like, I don't think you gain much by saying it has to be a pitched roof.
Yeah, that's the only one I really have a problem with, the pitch roof.
But yeah, by requiring it, I just don't know. I think there's too many ways to get around it, so you end up with, you're relying on someone trying to make a good, make a practical, good design rather than trying to be a wise guy with the property and hoping that they're not trying to do something crazy like that. It would have to make sense to them.
So I can strike those 2 out, and then leave the second one in there. It would just leave silent the standards for detached units. Is that something that we want to move forward with?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that sounds good to me too. Cool. Look at it all.
My next question is in C5. And this comes back to the floor area question. Where it says the total floor area, including the ADU, can't exceed the maximum floor area. But we've been told that we have to approve an ADU, even in excess of the floor area. So
We have to approve an ADU of at least 800 square feet. So if it's 800 square feet and it exceeds the floor area, then we'd have to approve it.
So the exception, stated in the clause, exception provided by 1722.060, that's all of everything that would allow an 800 square foot ADU.
I see. So what was the city council's rationale for not wanting to lower the floor area if we're going to have to approve of an extra 800 square foot ADU?
I don't recall at this time.
What I recall from council discussion is that it would almost appear as penalizing property owners. They're allowed to build up to a certain threshold currently, and by reducing that to accommodate an opportunity for an 800 square foot ADU without increasing that underlying density that's currently existing is almost like a taking, so they didn't want to go that direction.
Okay. It just seems like, on our standard sort of size R1 lot, you can build 2,100 square feet. And if you can now build an extra 800 feet, that's a huge increase percentage-wise. Like if you've got a giant lot and you go over by 800, it's no big deal. But I don't know. I guess I get outvoted on that one. But it seems like that's a big ad that is coming in by this combination of state law and are not wanting to sort of address that.
I think that keeping that in mind as we
contemplate other projects will be a very important thing to do.
Yeah, especially when you consider that, you know, how we define floor area, right? So you can hear a number, and you have to think, oh, we have to translate that, because you could hear a 3,500 square feet, and it's really going to end up being well over 5,000 square feet.
Anything else moving
Um,
down?
In height standards, again, I think this is fine for now, but I don't think this is gonna last for very long. But I don't know what else we're supposed to do, because we can't guess, you know, what the state is gonna do. They're gonna do what they're gonna do. And then, I guess the other question I had is, the concept of recordation, we've kicked this around a few times, and I still don't understand why we think this is such a big issue. Is it just because of the prohibition on Airbnbs? I mean, what's so special about an ADU versus any other, like, if you build a house or you build an addition, you don't record something that says, I'll follow the rules.
So I believe state law requires, and I'm just confirming now, but I believe state law requires that for a JADU, that a deed be recorded. So that's a state requirement. And we're extending that to, I believe we're extending that to ADUs in the ordinance as well, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And so the state law reasoning is because people might apply for a JDU and then like just change it back on the weekend?
No, I think the whole purpose of the recording is so it runs with the land. And so, although we might, if you issue a permit and in the permit requirement you say you're not going to have an ADU, well, that permit requirement will apply to that homeowner. But if they sell the land, it won't apply to the new homeowner. But if you record it on title, it will apply to the new homeowner. So in perpetuity, they want to limit these 30-day rentals because the whole point of this ordinance is to increase the housing stock, not to increase the rental housing stock or the short-term rental housing stock.
Right, so it's really sort of to combat the no Airbnb thing.
Correct.
Okay.
Convertibles and low income. That's right. It's also deed with.
Our current restriction, our deed restriction has no low income requirements. We can include those. We did consider it before, but this is not part of the discussion today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure it's not, but it's not something the states can lay on. Okay.
No, because when we figured out that SCAG counts ADUs as a certain number of ADUs as moderate income, right?
Low income.
As low income. So at first we were concerned that they weren't going to count all our ADUs as affordable because some of them are in fact affordable. But when the Southern California Association of Governments, with HCD's approval, said that we're going to count X number of units as affordable, then we didn't think there was a need to impose the affordability requirement because that's just more enforcement and difficult to track.
Yeah, and you know, somebody who's got a homeowner who's got one ADU is supposed to, you know, collect people's tax returns and turn them into that's a big bureaucratic nightmare. So that makes sense to me. I mean, I think trying to crack down on the Airbnbs is another tough enforcement, but I guess it at least gives us a hope. So I'm fine with that then. It makes sense.
Yeah. Where are we at? Permit termination, or where are we?
Yeah, those were all my comments. You know, I think the historic preservation and the tree preservation concepts aren't needed logically, but I understand the concept of putting them in here so if somebody, like a homeowner who's not an expert and hasn't, you know, big developer who's looked all through the code, they sort of have a one-stop shop and they can understand. So from an operational standpoint, I can see putting it in. That makes sense to me.
I like that idea.
I'll note also that the tree preservation provision differs from the tree preservation provisions in the code. This is intended to be more streamlined because, as Planner Wolf can probably point out better than I can, under this, there is no discretionary review. There's really, you just get a report, and then whatever the report says the mitigation measures are, those are the mitigation measures. It's not coming back to anyone for any kind of discretionary approval.
Is there an ability to bake in an appeal if somebody wants to, or are we not
The
concerned?
appeal is the ADU permit appeal.
And that would,
It's part of the, yeah,
and so that would go to the planning commission.
that would go to the planning commission.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that works.
It's the same thing with the historic provisions. Those aren't exactly like the historic provisions in the code either. It's the same deal. There's no discretionary demolition permit that's going to be issued. The historian issues the report. If it's determined to be historic, they'll have mitigation measures, and you got to follow those mitigation measures. And the external third-party historian is creating those mitigation measures based on some kind of standard that they use per state law, I suppose.
And the appeal cost is a percentage of the underlying permit, right? So it's not super expensive.
Yeah, but operationally, I'm not exactly sure what is being appealed.
Well, I mean, if you're a homeowner and you don't like the mitigation measures that staff is putting on your ADU, you could appeal to the planning commission.
They could appeal an ADU permit.
That would then bring it to a public hearing, which is not part of state law's allowance for ADU applications, as I
But if
believe.
they've appealed it, that's
Yeah.
gotta override that.
Yeah, that seems. I see the gray there. I think in this case, if a permit is granted or issued in the first instance, that's what the state cares about when it talks about ministerial approval. An appeal of that decision, I think, per our code, would go to the planning commission, and then they have a right to sue after that. That's what I would opine if the issue came up.
Okay, well, probably we're not gonna see a lot of appeals, but there's the avenue in case we need it, so that's fine. Yeah.
All right.
So we need a motion?
Is it?
Yeah, I'm good. Anybody else?
Yeah, go ahead.
I move that we direct city staff to return this at a future meeting to be reviewed for becoming code. For a public hearing, thank you.
And which option of the ordinance would you be choosing?
I think all of them with the edits that we've suggested.
Number 4. Okay. Thank you.
I'll second that.
Have a second. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And opposed? Passes unanimously with 1 abstention. Thank you, Bob. You can come back, Bob. Very good, thank you. All right, that moves us on to last part of the meeting, planning commission reports. Anybody have anything things coming up? I don't know, this is I guess we're gonna have one of the community foundation's gonna have a wine and whiskey event finally again, so.
Did you get a TEP?
I don't know.
Yeah, me too. That was exactly what I was thinking.
Okay, Planning and Community Foundation, Preservation Department, Director Gonzalez.
Yes, so we will be having our first public hearing for the Meadows at Bailey Canyon project on May 7th. It'll be at 7 p.m. unless directed to hold the hearing earlier. I'm trying to keep that as the only item on the agenda for all of our
May 7th?
I mean April 7th.
I think that's a Saturday or something.
April 7th. And so we'll be having our public hearings basically the first Thursday of each month as we progress if necessary.
And that's just the first initial meeting. It's not a quasi-judicial session where
It
we
is
have to
a
keep
public
track of the
hearing.
5 count.
Oh,
It's a public hearing, and it is not subject to the 5 count. Also, on March 22nd, public hearings before the City Council. They will be considering at public hearing the R3 housing updates and the church overlay, the land use map and zoning map consistency update, the affordable housing ordinance, which was chapter 17.34, the small home lot development, AB 803, and the urban lot split pursuant to SB 9, including the ministerial design review permits that were included in SB 9 and AB 803. We'll also have a consent item before City Council. It's the Housing and Community Development Annual Report. It's a consent item, and essentially what we're doing is reporting to HCD, which we've already submitted the report due April 1st. That quantifies the number of new units either built or in progress, or applications submitted, or in the building permit process. So that quantifies those items. And to give you an example, we had 12 ADUs, or 17 ADUs, that submitted an application, and going through the entire process for 2021, we had 12 of them be completed.
Oh, that's good.
that's great.
Because we got a lot of pushback on HCD that we're gonna be able to produce that many, and
Yeah,
it
we
seems
did.
like, yeah, we are.
I told her.
Yeah.
That concludes my report.
Great. Well, thank you.
I have a question on the Meadows project and the way it's gonna be processed, and you don't have to answer this now. It's something maybe you can ruminate on and tell us at our when we get to the public hearing. But normally when we have public hearings for a project, you know, we have like 1 or 2, right? And so we don't give any of our feedback until the end. And here where we have tons of meetings, it seems strange, especially on the legislative items that should be so iterative, that we don't give any of our thoughts, you know, until the end. And we've heard hours of testimony already and read thousands of pages. Is it appropriate in some of these meetings for us to say, look, this is where I'm sort of at now, so that people can address the concerns that we list? And I just feel like we sort of are starting to get to the point where we're hearing the same stuff over again, and people don't know where we're at. And I don't know where the other commissioners are at. And so you sort of have to think of the whole project and say, well, if people want to say no, if people want to say yes as is, if they want to change this, if they want to change that. And it might be helpful if we could earlier on sort of narrow down to where there's potential consensus, and address that, and focus in on, you know, the issues that are really troubling.
Certainly, the Planning Commission can direct staff to structure it in such a way that you identify each of the concerns that you might have with the project, or identify the things that you think work well. We could also structure the hearing where we're talking about, you mentioned that there are multiple entitlements. Instead of listening to the presentations of every single entitlement, maybe we break it down into specific components. Maybe the environmental impact report requires further discussion than a lot line adjustment. But again, that'll be under the purview of the Planning Commission.
Yeah, and I'd also add that during the public hearing process, it's totally fine for commissioners to say, I don't like it for this reason, here's where I'm at, without actually saying, I won't support it, or I will support it, without taking such a hard position. I think it's completely fine to express your position, to express how you feel about a specific aspect of this project.
Okay, appreciate that.
That's helpful.
Can we talk about a little bit about that initiative that, nope.
Sorry, it's not agendized, and we can't talk about it now.
Okay, because there's confusion about what we do here, I think.
I'm happy to talk to you about that offline, Commissioner Dallas.
Okay. All right, very good. Then I guess we will adjourn our next meeting to the meeting of April 7th. Thank you.